A warm welcome, everybody. Our speakers here. My name is Adam Hems, and I'm the leader of the Houston Azure User Group, along with my co-leader. Oh, yeah, look at that. We've got a camera as well. Yeah, that's better. Technology works, Murphy. The technology works. Fantastic. That's better. And along with my co-leader, Kim Vardy, who will be up in just a minute. So I've been leading this group since 2016. And my day job is working with Azure all day, every day, and have done since, actually, I was at the launch of Azure in 2010. And I've done nothing but cloud since 2012 and nothing but Azure since 2015. I'm so sorry. It's been
my
good.
condolences, sir.
It's been good. It's been a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. And that's one of the reasons that I wanted to work on this group along with Kim and others like here, is to learn from others and share that experience a little bit. Not everyone I get to work with. I don't get to work with everyone. I get to work with lots of folks, but not everyone. So this is about sharing the learning, sharing experiences, not just from me to you and you to me, but from other members as well, because that's other things that I've seen. You know, we're all in our company work-day silos, right? We don't normally get an opportunity. We work in our companies, right? Or with other companies, one-on-one under NDAs and stuff like that. But we don't get a chance to, there's no NDAs here, right? No one's at work. This is part-time, this is fun, this is hobby time for us. And so it's a chance to chit-chat, learn from one another, learn from our speaker as well, who's choosing to be here, right? Well, I strong-armed him. Yeah. And he also said he wanted.
I love this stuff.
Yeah.
This is me.
Yeah, that's right. So it's fun. It's fun. So we're here because it's fun. And so that's what this is about. So if you're here for a sales pitch, you're in the wrong place. Not going to happen. But if you're here to learn something from the speaker and from each other, you're in the right place.
Just sometimes some of the stuff I talk about is being an anti-sales pitch for clients. Like,
that's fine.
Complicated.
This is broken. Don't use this.
I only have one suck slide. So
okay. See, that's actually the best stuff.
It's pretty good.
It's not the marketing. It's the real world. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's when we know it's going to be good. That's when we know it's going to be good. All right. So with that, actually, a couple of words from my co-host. Kim, you wanted to say something real quick, and I'll take some pictures while you're talking. Oh, okay. Fine. Go ahead. Look, you can be on the camera. Look. On Gareth's camera. Look. This is Kim.
Hi everyone. This is Kim. I am I'm a technical specialist. Co-lead with Adam. Been at Microsoft for 3 years. Been at IT over a decade, and I work a lot with Azure in the past couple of years, 10 years, and AWS as well. But I'm here. I'm to learn as well along with everybody else. One of the things I mean, this is a labor of love. We don't get paid for this, and we are thank you Microsoft for sponsoring food and drink tonight.
Yes.
So looking forward to learn and collaborate from you guys, as well as please let us know if you have any interest, you or your company have any interest in a hackathon, hands-on lab, workshop. Fill out the online form. Love to know what you interest in learning, and me and Adam can arrange that. A hackathon on site with you guys. So let us know. Just reach out to me and Adam. Thanks.
What is this form, and are we going to post the link to that in the chat? Are we going to pop it up?
Yes, I posted a link in the chat.
Okay.
In the chat already.
Okay. Click the link in the chat. We'll put it in the Meetup.
Yes, please.
Take a picture of the link in the chat.
Yes, yeah, I got that going.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you.
Okay. All right, cool. Thanks, Kim. All right. Without further ado, Gareth.
There'll be a little ado, but yeah, we're working. We need to adjust some things.
Yeah, no one in the room can see it, so I'm just going to join it.
That's good. We need to close that. And that be works. All right, so I'll try to do a little introduction while I'm kind of getting my sandbox all set up. So we use Cloud Guru for our training, and so I get a 4-hour sandbox in Azure. And so if you have Cloud Guru as one of your learning platforms, then the code examples and stuff I have will all work in there. The tricky part is that when you set it up, you get a brand new environment, which means you got to set up all my GitHub secrets real quick and make sure that they're all working properly. And it's okay if it's on a recording, because by the time this recording gets anywhere, all those secrets are gone. So it should be fine. Maybe a little bit about, let's see, let me see if I can start Tech. Get into the action. So as I'm going around, I like to be interrupted. So make sure that you are waving your hand at me, hollering at me.
We'll
Slides. Cool.
we'll plug
Oh,
in.
geez, that makes sense.
Yeah, no, we're trying to do it by team. So.
Okay.
There.
Very plug random things into my machine.
Yep. What the worst that could possibly happen?
Okay.
You're showing on the screen
It'll pop in.
the laptop screen, but not the big screen.
Yeah, I'm working on it. Working on it. Okay, let me stop that. Let's move over to make sure I extend. I want to duplicate.
You want to
Duplicate. Okay, duplicate. Are we duplicated?
No, it would come out on this one.
Oh, okay.
Let me try.
Come on.
So I've got two.
Wait a minute.
That was that.
Some big
And we'll see.
Lost everything.
Yeah, I turned off the screen share because I'm trying to. I don't want it to do a weird.
Oh, it won't. Yeah. Do the screen share with the.
And have we returned?
Nothing.
Nothing. Whole lot of nothing.
That's there.
All right.
There it goes. Now.
Nobody breathe.
Yeah. Okay. Now they can see it in the room. Yeah.
Why? Why did you do that?
Fine. Oops. Yeah. Necessary. Fine. We're rolling.
Is it unnecessary? It's just like the right amount of difficult.
Technology is just great.
It's like the right amount of difficult. So, let's do that. Spin. I'll get sticker. Okay, let me. I don't need to see y'all. So, my microphone's still here, so I'm gonna try to go
Yeah.
here a little bit angle so I can see everybody in the room here. So, my name is Garo. I am a software whisperer. That is a title I made up for myself. It was on a business card. It was on 2 business cards. But it basically is because I do a lot of consulting internally in the companies that I work for, and then went into like actual consulting. And so, it's really about a lot of listening to people, listening to what they're doing with technology, helping understand what their goals are and their hopes and dreams and how I can help them achieve it and help them succeed. Now, sometimes that's with Azure, sometimes it's not. But this talk has come from my experience in a few different clients working with Azure and running into some other weirdos who love Azure in that same client. And we could talk about some other things that we've done with it. And so as I go around the presentation, please interrupt me. So when you're on the phone, this is gonna be a little tricky because if one of you is watching the Teams on the so because I can't see it on my screen because I have to minimize it.
Yeah,
but
we'll watch you, Garo.
Please interrupt me, okay? I know you are taking time out of your day to listen to me talk. I love to hear me talk. I hear myself talk all the time. So I want you to interrupt me. I want you to ask questions. I want to raise your hand, be like, what did you just talk about? Or, hey, can you explain more of what this is? And I'll go into it. I've got some demos I'm going to go through. We're going to go through some hands-on stuff. And then I'll post all the source code in PowerPoint afterwards, and I'll post it on the chat for the meetup. So it'll all be good. Got it? Spin off. All right. So this is flexing with Bicep. All right. These are not big ones, but there's some muscle in there somewhere. It's powered by pizza and dreams. And so Bicep is Azure. Let's see. Where's my mouse? Here we go. Click. All right. We're going to talk a bit about Bicep. We're going to talk about Azure Resource Management. What is Bicep? And we're going to go over pretty quick. So who in here has actually used Bicep before? You don't count. I mean, you count, but not in this case, right? Okay, so Bicep, new. And who's done like Azure Resource Manager, JSON deployments, and Azure? Oh, beautiful. Okay, good. This is the right crowd then. We'll talk a bit about why Bicep is. And so if anyone's seen Guardians of the Galaxy, or let's see, that was actually part of Infinity War. It's like, who is Gamora? Where is Gamora? Why is Gamora, right? Why is Bicep? And so we'll talk about why is Bicep, because there's a lot of really cool things that come out of that. And I'll walk through some of the really cool parts about Bicep and how it works and some of the things that make it interesting. We'll talk about like what I've seen as infrastructure cost patterns in the real world. I'll give you an example of kind of that, and then talk a bit about what iterative workflows look like. And you'll actually see some of those as I go in and I deploy stuff using GitHub and stuff. Kim, please.
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that
Yeah,
spin up,
please, yes.
that spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up,
Someone's reading ahead of my slides.
that spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up.
Okay, let's talk a bit about that. So where does this all fit in? Azure, the cloud. I assume everyone uses Azure, or I'm gonna assume a baseline understanding of Azure. And if there's anything that's kind of really weird, just please raise your hand and I can clarify. Azure uses Azure Resource Manager, or ARM, to do deployments of resources. So when you deploy something in Azure, it follows the same way of deploying it. It lets you figure out things like policies, permissions, where it goes, all this stuff has to be reused. And so you have a single kind of like behind the scenes way to make this work. And so when you go to the Azure portal and you click, when you go into the CLI and you type stuff out, or you use any of the other clients, you use a Terraform or a Bicep or an ARM or whatever, it eventually all goes to Azure Resource Manager, and it follows and applies all the rules uniformly. It does all the things in a consistent way, and everybody is happy, and the cherubs sing, and all your stuff gets deployed. Now, the tricky thing, and there's a link here, so when you get the presentation, there'll be a link. There's a whole bunch of description, and this with a stolen diagram, which I like. The thing you have to keep in mind is that the top half, your SDKs, your portal, all these other pieces, the REST APIs, all this stuff can run outside of Azure. So all the preparatory work you do to get things together to talk to the resource manager can't happen outside of Azure. Sometimes inside Azure, but it can happen outside of Azure. But everything that's Azure Resource Manager and below only runs inside Azure. And this is important because when you're trying to coordinate deployments of things, you have to know that that deployment is happening from inside the building. The call is coming from inside the house. And so it's a little interesting in the way things kind of work. So for example, who's used AWS? So in AWS, have you used Terraform with AWS? All right. So with Terraform and AWS, it goes to all the individual services and says, you deploy this, you deploy this, you deploy this, you deploy this. And so this is calling out to everything. But if you use CloudFormation, the call for CloudFormation comes from inside the building, from inside AWS. It says, hey, deploy this, hey, deploy this, hey, deploy this. With Azure, it's all uniform. So if I go to the portal and I click to deploy something and I say create, what happens is it kicks off a deployment. That deployment is an ARM template. That template gets processed by the same mechanism, and so it's really nice and easy. So it makes it a bit more predictable, whereas AWS can sometimes make things unpredictable in some ways that it does things depending on how you're running. So why does this matter? This matters because if I can come up with ways to interact with the top half, I know that they're going to uniformly work on the bottom half. So if I have ARM templates, if I come up with some snazzy portal website that does all these deployments for me, or I come up with something else, it can all kind of work uniformly, and it works. That's ARM. Now, when I say why Bicep, how clear does that look? Let me look from this side. Yeah. Okay. Cool. This was gonna be done in time anyway. So let's jump into the portal. Come on, portal. Portal power. Oh, come on. That's not what I wanted. You. Hey, I'm talking to you. Click. There we go. Spin up. No. Spin up. Spin up. That. Zoom that. Spin up. How is that size for everyone?
Yeah, great.
Wonderful. So this is Azure. This is actually a Pluralsight Cloud Guru sandbox that I've created, that it will be alive for up to 4 hours, and it will be destroyed forever. It's perfect for these type of presentations. When we want to create something, I'll say, let's create something. Create. And I will say, I want to create a storage account because storage accounts are fun and everyone knows how to do them. And and they're amazing, and I can try to find one. And even though the first hit is not the storage account I want, Microsoft, look, it's the second one. Is this a sponsored link?
That's been
Finally.
that's been
Anyway, so I'm going to create a storage account.
that's been that's been
231 results for storage account, but I just want the second one.
You can pick the Azure service only.
Yeah, but then I have to click it every time. Every time I type in, I have to click Azure Services Only, so I stopped. And this,
You don't really want to use the portal to do this kind of thing.
no, you don't.
You don't really. There needs to be another way.
There needs to be a better way. So I'm just going to click some stuff and say I'm going to make some things, and this is really not important, but I'm really going to get into like, so there's some advanced settings I can set. There's some other stuff I can set, some networking and cool stuff. Cool. Let's assume that I did everything I wanted and I want to review and create. So what I will do is I'll go in and say view automation template, and it will generate me. So newer versions of Portal will give you Terraform and Bicep now in the preview, I think. So watch out for it in whatever portal you have access to, but this one doesn't have those features turned on yet, but they're coming. So this is a giant JSON file, and I'm going to load into VS Code because it's more fun. VS Code has more fun. And then I'll make this nice and visible for everyone. So let's go light mode because it works better for presentations. And we'll make it bigger, 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 bigger.
that's been that's been that's been that's been
So I'll create a new file, and I'm going to make this a JSON file.
that's
And I'm
been
going to paste what I got from Azure, and I get this JSON monstrosity. And it's not too bad. If you once you start to see these a few more times, you get to understand them. And so at the top, they have a list of parameters, which is everything you could possibly do and set with a storage account, including some unused ones, which somehow generates an unused key. And then it gets into the resources where it actually generates it, says, I want a storage account. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in all of these different parameters that I just put in the top list. So you'll see fun things like this, where you take a JSON string, and if it's got square brackets, it does something special with it. And if it has, there's some other weird stuff in here. Let's see. And then we've got all little sub children. So anyway, it's a lot of stuff. Scroll, 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 scroll. Now, I take the same one and I say, all right, what I want to do is I want to create a new
that's been
file, and I'm going to make this into a Bicep file.
that's been
I'm going to say, treat this as a Bicep file. And then what I do is I paste the same text, and what happens is it gets decompiled into Bicep directly. So now we see that things are a little bit smaller. So a lot more cleaner on the thing. One, very few curly braces, very few punctuation. So for those of you thinking like, well, why is this? So one is like this parameter list is very simple. Here it is, param, identifier, data type. I don't want a resource. Again, it's just kind of like there's a semi-significant white space. So you put a brace here and it kind of does the right thing. You can format it, and it looks very nice and clean and simple and short compared to it. So step one, I mean, reason one is that it's a more concise way to explain what's going on with your templates. And when you use Bicep, it compiles it to ARM anyway. So it's making the JSON file for you, but it's doing just like your compiler does. It takes, if you're using a C# compiler, or using a whatever compiler, it takes all this fun stuff you've created and converts it into machine readable code and nice stuff. So in this case, think of ARM JSON as the machine code that gets fed into Azure to go and deploy all your stuff. Questions so far?
that's been
All right. There's a lot of cool, a few other cool things I want to talk about. And let me make sure I go with my come on, get clicking. All right. So we did all this. So there is a Bicep extension. So if you're using VS Code, if you're using, there's a Visual Studio one too. Visual Studio, VS Code, if you're using any of the JetBrains IDEs, they all have a Bicep extension you can install that gives you the IntelliSense and some other cool stuff. So highly recommend that one. There is also, you will want to use the ARM template extension. And this one is ARM Tools. This will give you if you end up pasting a JSON file into there, it will, the first time you paste the JSON into it, it will take a good like 30 seconds to warm up. And then it'll give you some IntelliSense and other stuff. So it's a little bit helpful in some of the things you want to do. Because sometimes you want to do stuff like, I want to take this and I want to visualize. And so I'll have a visualizer that I go full power. So very complex deployment. There is a file, there's a storage account, there's blob services, and it kind of gives you like the arrows and stuff and how these things are related. Not much else going on. If I did network stuff, there'll be a lot more goodies. Spin up. So these are extensions you want in VS Code. And then we talked about creating, so I've got these in the slides in case you do it. Now, the tricky thing is, now if I want to use this module, so it's like, all right, cool. I created this resource, I created this module, and I want to reference it. And so I've kind of done this already. So I've got the storage account I've created. And so when I want to use it, and I'll do my thing. I say, okay, now, one of the cool things about Bicep is you can reference modules really easily. And so in ARM, you'd have to create like a sub deployment. And I think you can inject JSON files or reference them by file, or is it like everything has to be in one file? I forget. Spin up. Painful. So what I'll say is I want to say module, which means I want to reference an external module. I'm going to call it storage because I'm unoriginal. And I want to reference the file name here. So what's cool here is like you can actually like, I can just, IntelliSense will tell me like, oh, here, Bicep. Now what it'll also tell me is that I need to give this module a name. So in Azure, when you have a module, this equates to a deployment. So when you deploy this into Azure, you're going to see a deployment tree, and I'll show you what that looks like. And you have to name everything. Again, I hate naming stuff. Naming stuff is hard. So you can get clever and just call it storage. This is fine if you're just deploying it to a resource group where there's not much else going on. But if you're doing bigger and more exciting deployments, then you may do something clever. Like say, okay, I want to get my deployment name, but I want to make this into a string, and then I want to make it into storage. So then this will kind of take the name of the deployment that you do. When you create a deployment, you got to give it, everything has to have a name, even if it's randomized. And so you get kind of components of it, you'll see. So let's say call it storage. Now I want to say, okay, what are my parameters I want to apply to this? Because I want to have required properties. Oh, that's easy. Required properties. What do I require? Everything. This is really painful. This is not fun at all. This hasn't saved me any time. Now I have to fill in all this stuff. What does all this stuff mean? I don't know. Location. What does that mean? Kind? It's a string. What does it mean? I don't know. Can tell me? No, it's not going to tell me what it wants. This is terrible. I hate this. Don't do this. So this is, if you take while you can, take your existing Azure infrastructure and export it to ARM template and try to deploy it as a Bicep and decompile it, it will technically work, but it will be unusable because the parameters are not readily described. There is not any hints as to what you're supposed to call it. There's no wrist friendliness. I have not saved myself time. I have transferred my pain from JSON to now Bicep, and I will experience the same amount of pain and suffering. And I don't like that whatsoever. So what am I supposed to do? Well, I need to do something nicer. And so my question is, does Bicep give me something nice? And the answer is yes, of course it does, because otherwise, why would I be talking to you about Bicep? I'd be talking about Terraform instead if it did not. So what does Bicep do? Bicep started in 2021. Bicep was started as kind of like really with the intent of making a nicer way to talk about ARM templates and added a bunch of really interesting stuff. Loops, conditionals, parameterization, integration with CI/CD, public module registry, user-defined types, user-defined functions, and then something called Azure Verified Modules we'll talk about. Why is it good? One, it's not JSON. Please and thank you, right? It's actually pretty fun to do Bicep code. I find that it's a very expressive language, and I've done a lot of weird things with it. I'll show you some of the weird things in my code samples that I've done with it that were really fun. The community is very active. They have monthly calls that you can get on the schedule for, and they show their latest features. They'll do a lot of studies with people. They'll have discussions, and like it's a pretty nice community. They're adding more stuff. They're adding support for Entra ID. So if you're wanting to, so ARM templates on their own can't actually interact with Entra, Active Directory, Azure Active Directory. But they're adding a provider that lets you extend into those and give you more of those capabilities so that it runs a little bit extra stuff that lets you interact with Azure, with Entra. They also already have a Kubernetes provider. So in theory, what you can do is if you set up a Kubernetes deployment, you can have Bicep generate manifest files using Bicep language, and it does a little conversion for them. It's great for bootstrapping. So if I create a Kubernetes cluster and I'm like, I need to do a few extra things to get it started, and then my GitOps can take over, this is a great way to do that. So just to kind of get it started. It's a really easy learning curve. What I find is that when I talk to teams that have never done infrastructure as code, Bicep has been a really easy jump into that. It's not a heavy language. You don't have to manage state files. You don't have to install anything extra, like really anything materially extra. You still have to install a Bicep compiler, but it comes with the VS Code extension. It's a really tiny thing. So the main thing is this: getting it to people who haven't done it. This is a great entry point into infrastructure as code. But as you saw, if they do it the naive way, it's worse than doing it. So I'm going to show you kind of some of the where things are nice, which is where we talk about AVM, which is Azure Verified Modules. So what is the weakness? It is really about Azure only. Like, it's not that I can take my Bicep code and run AWS stuff with it. It's kind of not the point. Thanks, Microsoft. And like Azure Resource Manager, validating it in the loop is pretty hard and takes a lot of time. The what if support is iffy, like to see, like, what am I going to deploy here? I don't know yet. Naming things is still hard, and I'll complain about naming things a lot. And I'll show you all the cool ways in which we name things. Documentation is sometimes annoying, but it's getting better. And then the IntelliSense is not terrible. But and I'll show you what it looks like too, because it's pretty cool. Okay. So question on the line, is this give you a little bit of heads up, at least the why Bicep? Is it better than Terraform or Pulumi or XYZ technology? It's different. My consulting answer, of course, as always, is it depends. If you have a team that needs to take on this work and do it, Bicep is probably the easiest way to get a team that's going from 0 to 1 onto an infrastructure as code pattern and starting to look at best practices and automation. At that point, they can then say, okay, you know what? I feel like we need a Terraform, a Pulumi or something. We need to go bigger, go more amazing. And then you have that opportunity. But because now they've thought about the pain points, they've thought about their processes. But I don't recommend starting there if you're going with a new team. Now, if you have a seasoned team, they are Terraform experts. They have terraformed Mars and Venus and Pluto and whatever. Great. Bring Terraform in and use it. It will be your best tool for the job because you know it in and out. You know how to operate it. You know how to operationalize it. You know how to automate it. Go be free. Don't touch Bicep. Bicep is great if you're getting started and you have nothing, or if you're trying to get another team that has just getting started, and it is an amazing entry point into infrastructure as code. So that's my opinion. I'm sticking to it. Let me get into examples. Let's go explore. So I want to talk a bit about, where's my VS Code? There it is. I didn't recognize it because it was light. I'm looking for my dark VS Code. This is the light one. So there's a lot of cool stuff in the type system. And if for anyone that's used TypeScript, it's very TypeScripty. How's the size on this? You want me to go bigger?
No, okay, good, Gary.
Good? All right. Yes, please.
Spin up that, 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 spin up that.
So you would use PowerShell. All right. How exactly? So be more specific, please, with your question, because I can go in 5 different directions, but I want you tell me what you're thinking of.
Spin up that, 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 spin up.
Okay. So
spin up.
Okay. Bicep has pretty rich string manipulation, object manipulation, and some of the JavaScript. They added a spread operator recently, so you can do like cool spread stuff and link objects together. And I can show you some examples. But so if I get into, like, you have arrays, you have rich object types, you can set up things like where you say, okay, I want it to be one of these things. And then the IntelliSense takes over and says, oh, it's one of these things. That's great. It's a type, it's a string literal, and it's going to be A, B, or C. And so you can tell it that, okay, it's got to be ARM, Azure, or Bicep, one of those three things. So that we have those limitations. So if I wanted to use this type,
that, spin up, that, spin up, that, spin up.
yeah, the type system looks a lot like, it's inspired a lot by TypeScript, but it's not exactly TypeScript. So it's a simpler version of that, I would say. So don't go too crazy with it because it still has to be translatable to ARM template. And so what you'll see is that Bicep adds some cool features, but then the underlying ARM language has to also update to support some of the cool stuff that they're doing, which it has. It has made improvements that way.
That,
you can do rich object types, so I can create a type. These are all user-defined types that I'm creating, so I can create a storage account config that has a name and a SKU. I can create optional types, and then I can do some weird tagged union stuff, which I did. There's some weird stuff you want to do if you want to do it, but you can. So like, for example, if I want to take this, I want to make a param of type, let's call this A is the type, and I'm going to call it storage account config type. And then I'm going to say, okay, I want to use this A somewhere. So I'm going to say B equals A. So it'll give me some IntelliSense here. Like, okay, the name is coming and it's required. The SKU is coming. It says required, but it's not actually required. So there's a little bit of goofiness going on here. So that should actually be a option. See, it says optional here, but here it says required. So there's some goofiness. Oh, because I didn't call it the right one. This is optional. There we go. Now what I'm doing, I go to SKU, and of course, now it says SKU is optional. So if you're familiar with TypeScript, you do this kind of vertical bar notation. So it can be a string or it can be a null. So it also gives you access to the safe access operator, which means that I can do this dot question mark, and that's going to say, okay, if that value exists, return it. If not, return null. So then I look at my B, and my B is either a null or a string. So it's doing a lot of type inference for you. It's figuring it all out. You don't have to be explicit when you don't need to be explicit. And so it's going to give you like, okay, this is probably what you want, and it does a good job of it.
Spin up.
If I'm doing, let me see. Start
spin up.
It will give you errors, yes, at compile time. So if you're mismatching the types, you'll know at compile time that the types didn't work out. And also it'll turn red in the left side of VS Code. It'll be like, you screwed up, dude. And so it'll let you know. So a lot of good stuff. So if I call this something that it doesn't exist, now there is a little bit of fuzziness in this because some of these object types, okay, so this is variable degree, so I've never used, but it's not going to highlight that this is not a real property because I have the forgiving operator. But if I take this out, then it will complain that, hey, this thing is not valid. Because what could happen is because it's, again, like you think about JavaScript, the object types, it can be any number of properties that are on there. And so it might be that that property could exist. And if I'm putting a question mark there, I'm saying, hey, compiler, this might exist. If it's there, give it to me. If not, that's cool. Like an experiment. So you wouldn't integrate it with, you could, but you wouldn't really do it. Normally, because this is part of your deployment. And so what you're doing is your deployment activity to Azure becomes a different setup. Normally, you don't compile your code and then also do a deployment. You might, but you may use some other tools in the mix. So technically, yes, you could. As long as you can do an AZ deployment create or deployment group create and then deploy it into your deployment group, into your resource group, cool. The AZ CLI will take Bicep files directly and it'll just compile it for you. And then it will ask you to install the Bicep module directly. And so you can kind of like, it's all part of your integrated flow. So if you can do AZ deployment group create, you can use Bicep the same way. Bicep also has a command line tool you can use to compile stuff. It's actually all .NET based. So if you want to see a really interesting C# code base that implements a compiler, that's one to check out. All right, lots of cool type stuff. And so now I come back to my storage with no types. So if I say, here's my module that I created, now I've simplified it a bit. So what I said was, okay, I'm only going to say, pass me a SKU for the storage account. And this can be one of these two values. or I'm going to say, I can use user-defined types and get it a little bit interesting and gives me a little more activity. But again, I can say that. So when I'm going to use this, I'll come over here and I'll say module.
That's
two, and I'm going to do storage with types. I'm going to say equal and required properties. So of course there's less because I put less in there. But now what I can do is I can go to this name and it says skew, it has to be one of these two values. If I go over here in control space, it'll offer me these two values to pick, which is super nice. And I can extend this into bigger and bigger things that I do. So this is how you make it a little bit nicer to work with this stuff.
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up.
But type system is cool because you can basically create user-defined types. You can pass them in, and then so when I'm passing them into the objects, as long as the properties match, it will connect the dots for you.
That spin up, that spin up,
Let's
that
take a short
spin up.
pause. So type system, anything weird about type system that you want to ask about or see or do a little bit more of?
That spin up, 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 that spin up.
It is
That
evaluating them as it goes. So when you create user-defined types, they're going to get added. And all of your like Azure resource types have user-defined types as well. So if I look at this guy here, storage account, see these all have like comments and stuff on them. This is actually like part of the resource. This is included somewhere. Yeah, this is the schema for this type here. So
that spin up, 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 that spin up.
Same as the REST API to deploy stuff. All the same stuff. So I can go in here and I can say view documentation and it'll take me to the place it needs to go. That's pretty good. Let me get into some more practical, and I think there'll be some cool stuff. So let's get into this one. So I put some links in here of cool stuff to learn about. User-defined functions are cool. I'll show you some of those actually. Lambda, I'll show you some of those. That's some fun stuff with that with networks. Oops, sorry. Okay, got it. Safety reference. So there's a lot of cool stuff in the documentation to talk about. So moving forward, I want to talk a lot about modules and documentation because let me make sure. I should be good for how much time do I have on this thing? Battery says
that spin up.
All right, we'll go fast.
Shall I, sir?
Yeah, I got one.
Live right up there.
Anticipate.
I'll do it.
Picture. Whoa, watch toes. Give me that end. You take that end.
That spin up, 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 that spin up.
Oh,
that spin up, 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 that.
Back in the day, I used to watch a lot of Top Gear, and Top Gear had Top Gear's a British like racing show, and one of the jerks on there likes to say like whenever he's like punching the car, they say power, and so somehow my daughter picked it up, and so I have a 3-year-old daughter, and then when she's like trying to push something, she'll go power. Lost it the first time she did it. I'm like, that's amazing. I love it. Modules. One of the really powerful things about Bicep is modules. And you saw a little bit about it as I was exploring. But this is really how you make this into a user-friendly, developer-friendly API surface for your teams to use to deploy resources. Because you can take subgroups of things and you can put best practices around them, parameters, outputs, and you can make it all work. The weirdest thing I did with this was that I was using an application gateway, V2. And so application gateway has this weird quirk that the entire thing has to be configured in one resource. So you can't configure it in parts like, hey, I'm going to add this target here or add this rule here or this thing in separate pieces. No, it has to be one giant JSON monstrosity. So what I did was I created a Bicep monstrosity that creates the JSON monstrosity in pieces and uses unions and other things to manipulate it into something that works. It even did fun things like it created groups of rules because you could only have like 8 rules at a time or 10 rules at a time in each batch, and there was some other like weird quirks. It's like I worked out all the quirks. And so from the user standpoint, they would say, I have a web application, it needs port 443, here's my certificate, please and thank you. And it would generate all the pieces. And it would say, I have 2 more web applications, please and thank you. And it would just merge it all together at the end and give you a consolidated configuration. And it worked reasonably well, but it was like what I would tell my team, like, okay, if you want to understand how Bicep works, figure this thing out. And that'll tell you how Bicep works. So fun stuff. Here's the thing about modules. What you want to do is that you could work at the bottom and do ARM directly, or use Bicep as ARM directly. So the first thing I showed you, right? If I take the ARM template, decompile it to Bicep, and I just fill in the blanks, I can do that. That's a lot of work. I can go to Bicep and Terraform, and I can use that plainly too. Sure. Also, a lot of work. But Microsoft has a thing called Azure Verified Modules. There's a link to it at the bottom. So when you get the deck, you'll actually see it. They have started to build a library of patterns to show you how to put things together, a library of resources to show you the best practices of how to use this, and some other little utility stuff. This has been really helpful because my biggest gripe with Bicep when I was using it 2 years ago was that they don't tell you how to do things properly. They give you, who's ever assembled like a model car, like, or a model train, or some sort of like model thing where they give you like all the plastic parts, you gotta snap each one out and you gotta assemble the thing together, and then you have to put the stickers on and paint it if you want. So what Azure has done, what Microsoft has done, is they've given you all the parts in the box, but only half the instructions. And then they say, here's what it should look like. You should make this car. It's amazing. They say, great, here's all the parts. Oh, that's cool. How do these fit together? Figure it out. It's like, well, this fits to that? Probably. Some things have nice connections, some things don't. But what happens at the end is like, you got the car built. It's standing up. It doesn't move because you forgot something, right? And this is how it works, is that you put some pieces together. You're like, I think this is how it should work. It compiles, surprise. It deploys, even more surprised. But then it's up, and then you start going to the objects in the portal, and it's like big red banners. This is not configured correctly, or you're missing this. Where's this resource? You know, and so you have to go and like fill in the blanks and go back and edit and read. So when you go to verified modules, a lot of that stuff is filled in. They say, hey, by the way, when you're using this setting, you need these 3 pieces to be in place. Let me go ahead and add these for you. Here's the permissions you can set over here, and let me give you the IntelliSense for those as well. You can add a lock on everything. You can do some other, like, it's all this kind of nice, friendly features to say, look, here's how you can use these nice. And you know what? I call it the realm of laziness. That's where I want to be. That's where I want to be. That's my spirit animal, is the lazy cat, or the lazy whatever. I saw it's because that's what work is about, right? Why am I repeating myself to doing this work when someone else can do it for me? Right? Of course, sometimes I'm the consultant and I'm the one that has to do the work because that's what they pay me for. But I'm going to go and find the patterns and practices that are already there. Azure Verified Modules does have Terraform libraries as well. There are other Terraform patterns published in other places. What I want to caution you on is when you go to those places, verify trustworthiness, because you are otherwise giving an open source repository direct access to your most secret of cloud environments. So make a copy, host your own version of it, make sure you've looked at the code and what it's doing, because that's going directly into that, you know, that super secret cloud thing that your IT department says that you should have, you know, separation of concerns and duties, and it's double, triple locked and all this stuff. And what you've done is you've taken this open source repository and said, okay, whatever I'm deploying in there, you get to do exactly what you tell me what to deploy in there, and I'll just listen to you. So read first. Don't listen to what Copilot or GitHub Copilot tells you directly. Read it, understand it, make sure you know what you're deploying, because guess who gets to support it? Y'all do. It's great. So Azure Verified Modules. And I'm going to say, work up here. Don't work down there. Let's talk a bit about that. What does that look like in practice? So I went back to my light mode, VS Code. And I said, let's get rid of these. And I said, all right, what does this look like with minimal? So there's some fun notation here. So the storage account is a module I'm getting. So this is a minimum one. And I say, okay, let's go to this notation. So what's different here is that if I'm going to make a storage account, I'm going to reference a local one. I'll say something like this, where I'll give it the Bicep file name directly. if I'm going to reference a resource, I'll call this a resource. And then I'll give it a nice name here. So Microsoft dot storage accounts like that, and then give it an API name. It looks a little different. So this notation here has BR for Bicep Registry, public, which is a well-known Bicep registry which Microsoft has created and manages externally. And then there's a path here, which says I want to go AVM res storage account. This is the version I want. Not terribly wrist friendly, but if I wanted to go do it here, IntelliSense, go to public, and I can find I want something with storage. I'll just have the word storage. I'll spell it wrong. Well, I won't spell it wrong. I'll just put it in the wrong place. Storage account. Oops. Storage. I'm angry. Gotta go back to the colon. All right. Storage account. And then I give a version. So it pops up the version numbers for me too. Pick the latest. And then equal. And then I give it curly braces, and I give another control space, and then tells me what it needs me to do. So this is actually pretty wrist friendly as you're walking through. Now, how did I know that that's the storage account I want? Well, I got to go somewhere else to pull that out. So I'll go to the website for this. And this is dark mode again. I'll zoom in, and I'll go to There we go. So Azure Verified Modules has a list here, and what I'll do is I'll go to Bicep modules, I'll go to resource modules, I'll search for the word storage. Oop, that's the wrong screen. Why'd you go there? Okay. Storage. Elastic nope. Storage account, yes, please, and thank you. So this will take me a link to GitHub. So it'll tell me which version is the latest. It'll take me to GitHub, and then I can go and see more stuff. Can I switch the mode real quick? I forget if I can do that. From here. Sorry, it's going to be a little dark. Now I think I have to go into settings to do it. All right. So it'll give you a README file that kind of talks about how to work it. It'll talk about which resources are actually being pulled into it, which version of those resources it uses. And you can even look at the source code of it in main.bicep and dig in yourself. So you can go and dig and see all the cool stuff. What does this actually look like? So these. So what we'll do is we'll give it a name for the deployment for the module. So this doesn't actually show up in your resource at all. This just shows up in the deployment when you're deploying into ARM. We give it a name for the storage account. This again has to have requirements. Backslink 24 must be lowercase, no hyphenation, no. Don't look at it funny because storage account names are very picky. And they have to be publicly, globally unique. Allow public bulb access. So it'll actually give you like some good defaults. So like, for example, if I say, you know what, this is normally false. But if I go to the default value here and I look at this and I say, would you say the default's false? So if I don't put it in, it's actually giving me the right value, which is what I expect. And it's giving me the right best practice that I want to apply. So the defaults here are actually pretty reasonable. So for example, here TLS 1.2, I would argue probably 1.3 is better for new stuff, but hey, can't win them all. But at least 1.2 is supported. And so like you're not even allowed to do 1.0 or 1.1 because those are no longer supported by Azure. Even though the API supports it, it will probably not deploy. Maybe. Or it'll deploy and then it won't work because it's blocked. So this is how it looks like. So if you have different pieces you want, it's pretty nice. And then there's also like you can get more complicated and say, okay, I want to do private endpoints. So what does this look like? What service do I want to use? How do I connect it to stuff? It can get more and more complicated. Which is good. Yes, go ahead. Oh yeah. It has all the same stuff. So what you can do is I can take this file. I can do bicep build ARM template. Is that what it's doing? Probably. Good. So it creates the JSON file conveniently. And then you can just kind of, now what's cool about this JSON file, here's a neat thing to learn. This is actually a good opportunity. So when you're using the Bicep modules off in the internet, what happens is they actually get embedded into your stuff here. So this is the deployment list. Let's go. So it actually creates a deployment for here's my deployment name of the module. And inside here, it has private endpoints. It has template, it has a sub-template here too. So this is the deployment template it's creating with parameters. And this has the other types and stuff. So if I go down, 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 it has all of the types that I've created, all the parameters, every parameter. So all these things that I didn't care about, I'm going to see this left side. This is all the stuff that it baked into the JSON for you. So it's compiling, what it's doing is it's pulling a snapshot of all the things in the world that you're referencing, combining it, creating a JSON file for it, and saying, okay, I'm going to deploy this for you. So at deployment time, when it compiles and it goes into ARM, Azure Resource Manager, it has everything it needs. All the pieces are in place. It is a single JSON file that goes and it deploys, and it's happy, and it thinks
that, spin up that, spin up that, spin up that, spin up that.
Then it gets deployed. So when you see it in Azure, it's already got as a deployment with all the inputs, and you can see the submodules and everything, and the sub deployments, and I'll show you.
That, spin up 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 that, spin up.
Yes, I ran into that a lot. So because I was doing this particular presentation, I was doing in a Cloud Guru sandbox. There are security policies in place, so you don't build weird stuff. Like I'm not going to set up this giant OpenAI model that's eating up $1,000 a second, right? Because they're like, okay, no, that's not part of your build. But same thing with like SQL. I should have said the same for a SQL server that's eating
that, spin up that.
Correct.
Spin up.
So you can't. There's a bunch of things you can't do, but I found a set of resources that do deploy. So if you try it in a Cloud Guru sandbox, it'll work the same. But it'll use policies. So because it's deploying through Azure Resource Manager, the policies are going to hit the same every time. So if you deploy to the portal, to the API, to this, to that, then it'll do the same. It'll do the right thing. Your policies hit, and you'll see the same error you would have seen from the policy that you would have seen otherwise.
That, spin up 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 that,
Yes.
spin up that, 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 spin up
Do it the right way. Yeah.
that, spin up 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 that, spin up.
Yeah. So what you can do, right? So what you'll do, so Azure policy will give you a set of rules that you can apply at whatever levels in your Azure account that will check when you're deploying something and will reject it if it disagrees with the policy, right?
That, spin up that, spin up.
I want to say yes. I think you can. I have not personally done it, but I have seen it done. And I know that companies will set up automation to do those deployments because it's just an Azure resource. As long, I say that just an Azure resource, but some Azure resources are more equal than others because, for example, Entra ID is not natively part of Bicep, but there's a provider that does it. So I think you just got to explore it and see if you want to do that and see what objects are supported in Bicep, and then you can see if there's some accelerators for that too.
That, spin up 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 that, spin up.
No, you'll have the same problem because what happens is that there are no resource types. And when you look at the ARM template reference, there are no resource types for Entra ID. You cannot create app registrations. You cannot create users and groups and other stuff. You have to go through some PowerShell or go through some other script or whatever. Terraform has it because Terraform is going through the APIs to create these things. And so it has like providers, extra providers for Entra ID and for other stuff that you want to do. Like if you want to make a Graph API call and say, okay, as part of my deployment, I want to pull this user's information because there's a group they're in or it's an automation user and I want to do some other stuff. That is enabled with the new providers for Entra ID for Bicep. Terraform has that in the Entra ID providers for Terraform. But you would reference that as a separate provider to do the separate work because the Azure Resource Manager resource does not do that work on its own. It has to call out to something else to do it.
That, spin up that, spin up.
So the downside of the approach that Microsoft has done is that if it's not supported in Azure Resource Manager, you have to go somewhere else to do it. But there is a type of deployment that lets you run PowerShell scripts, like willy-nilly. So if it's part of your deployment, you want to run PowerShell, you can. That comes back to the original thing I said, that what runs inside Azure, what runs outside of Azure. And then the little parenthesis caveat is where in Azure exactly does it run and what would you actually have access to? Because is it running in Azure public infrastructure network, or is it running in your private network, or somewhere else entirely, depending on where it is. So you got to be careful about that.
That, spin up 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 that, spin up.
So if you can do it in a ARM template, you can do it in Bicep.
That, spin up.
Yes. Would you? No, probably not. You may want to use a different way to put code in. So like personally, what I like to do, I like to deploy infrastructure first and by a separate kind of activity. And then I have a separate path for updating code and refreshing code, right? Because then I'll run like stuff, because I'll go into Kubernetes or container apps or app service, and I'll run database migration scripts and other stuff. I'll run that as an activity. But I don't want to happen is I don't want to run into the whole deployment infrastructure like machinery every time I do a build for my application.
That, spin up 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 that, spin up.
I have an example. So let me show you a bit of an example of kind of a place to start of how we do this. So
that, spin up that, spin up.
What I'm going to build is a very simple cloud application, extremely simple. So I have a subscription. I have one subscription because of the way the sandbox is set up. I have one resource group because of the way the sandbox is set up. And I'm going to use a technology called deployment groups or deployment stacks. So depending on where you look in Azure documentation, the identifier says deployment group, but all the documentation says deployment stack. So which one do you search for? It depends. But what it's creating is it's creating a unit of deployment inside a resource group that can be created and deleted and managed independently. And this helps you with some of your iterative workflows, but also grouping things within a resource group when you have limited capabilities. Because the favorite thing of IT security, some IT securities to do is to say, here's your resource group. Don't touch anything else. Don't even think about it. Don't set foot outside of this line, okay? Some of them are nicer and have ways to do other deployments and stuff, but sometimes it's just like, no touching. So here's what we do. We have to build some shared network capability over here on the left, and then we have to build our application on the right. Now I could have multiple applications deployed. This is the app service or the SQL Server. Have multiple applications share the same network. And then I can create multiple networks to have them independent. So my dev network different from my staging network, different from my production network. And I can deploy multiple workload and applications into each one. To the developer, all they need to know is that I have a web app. Can you tell me how to make a web app the right way? Please, Mr. Security person and infrastructure people. Because otherwise, I'm going to do it my way, which is the wrong way. But it's the only way I know, and I have to deliver something. So that's what you're going to get. So what we want to be able to do is create these common spaces and have a language for them to be able to talk to each other and say, here is the levers you can pull. Here's a control panel. There's 4 knobs, and there's one lever like this that you love to pull. Okay. So when you're going to deploy your application, here's what you can change, and here's the settings they all take, and then push the big red button, which is the good red button, not the bad red button, the good one. Push the good red button, and then it will deploy the things that you want. And so as you kind of create infrastructure resources, create
that, spin up 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 that.
So the pushing the code into the resources should be a separate exercise that you want to do. You can do it. You can do it as part of ARM. Now,
that spin up. That spin up 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 that spin up.
So you
have something that it means is
that.
So what I would recommend on that is I still recommend these to be separate processes, because what you want is you want 2 pathways. You've got your platform. Let's see here. You've got your platform team that's creating your patterns and practices for your infrastructure deployment and setting up the scripts and the templates and so on for you. Your development team is building code, right? But that code, so in a modern approach, that code generates a container image, right? It's a container image that gets created, hopefully again through standards and practices set by the platform team that say, okay, here's my base image, here's what you're going to use. It's a .NET application. Here's all the secure settings. I've done my supply chain indexing. I've looked for vulnerabilities. I've scanned it with all the security stuff I want to scan it with. This is a blessed image. Oh, it's ready to deploy, right? So then your deployment becomes a separate activity, which says, I'm ready to deploy. I've already vetted this thing, right? And then you go through an automation that says, take this and put it there, please. Now there could be a Kubernetes container app service, something else, right? But how that deploys is kind of like depends on the team and the project and the application. So that activity tends to be separate. You create all your deployments, you create your infrastructure, you create your Kubernetes, you create your container app service and stuff, then you move stuff into it as a separate, more repeatable activity. Now, when you adjust your infrastructure, it doesn't touch your code. If you're moving stuff around in your infrastructure, your code, as long as it doesn't touch that piece that's hosting your code, that code doesn't change.
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up. That spin up, 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 that spin up. That spin up, 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 that spin up.
So I'll show you a little bit of how we do that. It's not always as clean, but there are ways to do it. So let's see. I'm gonna get into demo time because I want to walk you through the demo because that's the most fun part. And then, so before I do that, I need to just make sure my GitHub and my other stuff is ready. So give me a moment to.
That spin up, 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 that spin up.
This one's here. So I need to.
That spin up, that spin up.
Oh, I already have that. That's already done. So let me pull
that spin up.
And this one goes here.
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up.
Here.
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up.
This is better on a bigger screen, but just give me
that spin up. That spin up, 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 that spin up.
So I'll show you a bit of what I've got here. So in my GitHub repository that deploys this,
that spin up.
I've got some variables and stuff set up. So what I'll do is I'll go into
that spin up, that spin up, that spin up.
Copy this over. So I'll copy my resource group name.
That
spin up that.
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up.
Make sure I don't put a blank line there because blank lines are secretly. Oh, come on.
Security.
Security.
Two-factor.
Who let this person in here?
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up.
Who did this? Honestly. All right. Then I'm going to do every location. Let's make sure the location's right. So this particular resource group is hiding in my, where are you, buddy?
That
spin up. Let's go find you in
that spin up, that spin up. That spin up, that spin up, that spin up, that spin up. That spin up.
Okay.
That spin up.
You are in East US party.
That spin up.
So I kind of need a little bit of, I guess, already East US. So I'm going to go to secrets.
That spin up.
And I'm going to copy some stuff over. So let me go into my light mode Visual Studio Code. We'll do a Z account show. So this will give me like my subscription ID. Oops. So if you're doing this in a proper GitHub that paid all their bills, then what you can do, not that I haven't paid bills, but what you can do is you can set up environments in GitHub. It's not great. It's really kind of like, I don't like it very much, but sometimes you got to do what you got to do. And this is what I got to do. But so if you set up environments GitHub, then you can basically set up the secrets Stop it. I said stop it. Right, I'm gonna pull this one.
That spin up.
ID. This is all just to make sure I can talk to Azure, which I would have done if I was
That spin
not stuck in the rain. But here we are. You get to see some of the sausage factory, and you get to see my passwords and keys for things that you shouldn't see passwords and keys for. And we get tenant ID. So tenant ID is interesting. Because tenant ID is like your entry ID for your account, and it should be useful. And I don't know why it needs all this stuff. Okay, okay. So now I've updated all my secrets, and I want to make sure that it works. So I have a validate Azure configuration. This is always super nice to have because this will just make sure that AZ login works and I can do something. This is actually running on GitHub with a real GitHub workflow. What it looks like as that runs up is this. We close that. So what it's doing is it's just doing an AZ, it's doing a checkout. It's running AZ login, Azure login with my secure credentials. So if there are other ways to connect. This is the way that I have to connect to the sandbox because I don't have OIDC credentials. But in a nicer situation, what you would do is you would actually talk to your IT security environment and you'd say, hey, this is my GitHub repository and environment. Can you create a federated credential for me, please? And it will create a behind the scenes connection that's passwordless that will automatically authenticate between GitHub and Azure and give you a credential that does the right things that you want it to do. Yes, Adam, please.
Online. Daniel asks, did you add this pipeline or is it built in?
The pipeline itself I created. So pipeline, by pipeline, I mean like this text file. I created this text file, but these actions that it uses are part of the GitHub Marketplace, which you can also get on your own. And so there are Azure login, Azure CLI things that are available. And so you just kind of click on it and look at it. The best way to find them is when you go to the GitHub Marketplace and you click on Marketplace, and then you can see these the Azure login action is here. But if you look for this, probably does the wrong thing. Let's see. No, search all of GitHub. No, that's not what I want. So you got to go to Marketplace for actually you click on Actions Marketplace Actions, and then if you search for Azure. Then it gives you like all the A looking ones. These are the ones you want. So they'll kind of say like Azure Login, Azure Web App. The ones that I'm using is I use Azure CLI Action. I'll do Azure Bicep deployment, and I'll show you where that is. But there's a few other ones on there that kind of make it easy for you to work with Azure deployment stuff in GitHub Actions. So I did not create those, but I will use them gleefully.
That spin up. That spin up. That spin up.
Does that answer the question?
That spin up. That spin up. That spin up. That spin up. That
Yes,
spin up.
it does. Thanks.
Cool. All right, so validate Azure configuration 2 minutes ago is successful. This means that I was able to log into Azure. I was able to execute a simple command that gave me the
that spin up. That spin up.
Command executed successfully. That's cool. Because all I did was basically say, show me a group with the RG name. And then when I go to
that spin up,
this one, then the output is going to be
that spin up
there.
That spin up.
Where's the output? Output.
That spin up. That spin up.
There is. Hey, where's my output?
That spin up. That spin up. That spin up.
That's not it. This is actually not. This is actually not the output. It worked, which is good, but I don't know where the output went. It may be that it's
that spin
up. I expect it to be. Oh well. Carry on. Sally forth. So what we want to do is I want to create my network space. And so what that means is that I'm going to deploy something a little more complicated. And what does that look like? It looks like what I put in my PowerPoint. Let me kick it off while we wait. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to deploy space. So space in my terminology is basically like where do I work? What is my areas I want to do stuff? So I want to do a deploy and I want to create a dev environment. So I'm going to call it dev. And so these names actually get propagated into the names of things. And so I'll say run workflow, and then it'll kick off the fun stuff that'll happen. Now, what does that even do? Light mode VS Code. So what that's doing is I'm creating, I'm starting here with this parameter file. And the parameter file is extremely complicated. So I don't expect you to get it on the first shot, but Bicep has this this parameter type. So instead of JSON parameter sets, you can create Bicep parameter sets. These are super cool because this means that you can use all of Bicep's expressions and kind of things and stuff and whatever to create a configuration file, which is pretty cool. And it's actually very non-verbose because if I did the same thing here, so for example, I went to this file, this file, and I said, I want to create a Bicep generate parameter file, and I want it to be a JSON parameter file, and I want to do all. So then what it's going to do is it's going to generate a little more complicated, but not too much more because I only have 2 parameters. But it generates this JSON with a schema and all this stuff. That's okay, but it's not as nice as this, which is a lot simpler. So what you do in the first line is you reference the Bicep file that this parameter file is for. So this is where it gets a little more tricky. This lets you give a lot of IntelliSense and it lets it validate the file for you. Because what it is creating basically a wrapper around the file to do a little bit of Bicep compilation ahead of time. So it's going to make that work. So what this does is this creates a more complicated set of resources. And we'll talk a little bit about these. So this creates the network, the log analytics workspace, the private DNS zones for my private link, and private link, my Azure Monitor private link scope that I need. So luckily, most of these are AVM modules. So this creates my log workspace, which is where all the logs go. I got to name things. So I'm creating, this is on my slide, right? I have a bunch of stuff to create, and they all need names. I hate names. Okay. So what I've done with Bicep is I've created some user-defined functions to make it easy for me. So I will go look at my user-defined functions and create names. So first thing I need to do is I need to go and find nice names for all of my Azure regions because they all have really long names. And that's a lot of real estate in my name to eat up. If I'm going to make it, like if I'm going to make a storage account that has 24 character limit, it's not going to contain the words South Central US. It will contain SCUS because I like to conserve energy. So I need to generate these lists. How do I generate these lists? I generate it with Excel because
Because that's
what you use.
Because that's what you use. This is a very complex and do it this way. So I don't something weird. So I'm going to go into my data files and I had Azure generate me a list of, and of course this, I can't make it too big. So it's going to be a little bit, make sure that window's gone. Good. So let's zoom in. Excel. Okay. So what I did was I generated the first half using the AZ CLI command and generate a TSV file. So generate tab separated values file. Open it in Excel, and I create a formula here. And this formula is something I'm very proud of because I had to do a bunch of research for. But there's a little formula that basically takes the words that are in the first column and will basically take all of the capitalized letters and numbers and mush them together and get rid of everything else, and then turn it into a Bicep compatible string here on the right side. So then what I do is I take all these cells and I copy and paste them into VS Code. And there's my Bicep. There's probably a more elegant way to do this with PowerShell. I don't know PowerShell that well, but exercise to the reader.
Copilot would help you create that formula.
It would. No, it did not. Copilot gave me the wrong thing twice. I had to go figure it out myself.
3rd time's the charm, Gary.
I know, right? It should be like, no, that does, because I even told it once, I'm like, that didn't work. It's like, okay, let me fix it. And I'm like, that didn't work either. It's like, you should go look at the help file. I'm like,
spin up that, 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 spin up that.
I didn't go through that one because this, but there's other ones. So there's other things too that you want to, so there's always kind of little lookup tables you want to do that are helpful to give you some wrist friendliness. But so in this case, what I want to do is I want to name a network. I need to name a VNet. So what I do is I come up with a name scheme. And then this was actually stolen from some links on Microsoft, and I have some links in the deck as well. But your company's going to have some naming convention. Just use it. Like, even if you hate it, even if you think it's dumb, just use it. Consistency is your friend here. Okay. because when you look at a resource, you want to be able to find like, what is this? Where is it? How is it? Because when it shows up in log files here, it shows up in what everything there. Like, what is this thing? This is where it belongs, right? It's okay. No human that cares will see the name. It's just us people that don't matter. We'll see it, okay? So the trick is you got to come up with a name for everything. Otherwise, you'll get something strange. So some tricks to do, for example, like I want to take the purpose of this VNet and I want to make it to lowercase. I want to take the name and I want to derive it from this, which is actually just turning it to lowercase as well. I think I did something else with this. And then I want to make it this zero padded. I want to make it 000 like a zero padded index. So zero padded index is kind of cool. I'll use this function, pad left. So string manipulation, got you. You can do some padding. You can do other string manipulation stuff. You can do there's a lot. It's a pretty rich set of functions you can go look up. You can do cool stuff like, so I have a list of these locations that I created as an object. So if I come up here, it's just a function that returns an object. And it gives you this list of locations, which are key value pairs. Now I can look at them. An object is a dictionary, so I can look it up the same way, much like in JavaScript. So I can say, give me the list of locations, and it just look up the location for me. So as long as I put in a location string that's valid, it will find me a number. If it doesn't, then we'll have some weird nulls and other things propagate. Everything will explode. That's good. It should not compile. That's amazing. So I created a bunch of functions for naming stuff because every time I came up with a name, I'm like, I need a way to consistently generate the same name that I did over here. This is one way to do it. This is not the best way to do it. It is a way to do it. Another ways you can do it is once you generate a set of names, you can have it like output it into a Bicep file and put it in your source code repository so they can reference it by hand. So you're not calculating it every time, because if you change your calculation, it is not retroactive to your previous resources because you can't rename anything. So be careful with these functions, because if you change it, it will change it for how you reference things back and front and may not be what you want. So getting back to what that is, log workspace, I created virtual network. This one's a fun one. I found a cool tool called Visual Subnet Calculation that helps me calculate subnets. So I say I have a subnet that's 24, mask of 24, there's 254 hosts available, and I'm going to split it, and then call this up. Yes, I love this so much. This brought me such joy because subnet splitting is soul-crushing, horrible work, okay? And this was just beautiful. This was so lovely. And I could just put like notes on here and whatever. It's called Visual Subnet Calc. And then you can even have a shareable URL. And so it'll come in here and it's probably just, it's just encoded in there. That's beautiful. Isn't that great? People, this is beautiful. Okay, sorry, I'm crying. This is great. So for subnets, I'll come up with little names, I'll come up with prefixes, I'll do delegations. So a lot of little stuff that's kind of like, again, this happens once, and then there's this cool one. This is beast. So if you've ever done private link, private DNS zones in a corporation, you need to create like 80 of them. This little pattern module creates them all for you. Tag to your region. So good. And then links it to the VNet you want to link it to. So if you got a hub VNet set up, you launch this sucker and it just generates the list for you, and you can add to it if you want. But so good, so good. Private link scope. The only thing it doesn't do is I had to kind of goof this one a little bit, where I had to link the scoped resource myself. But there's some goofy, so I could take some of that code and use it. This creates a network. It creates all the core things I want. By now it should be done. And then it should be green. Should be happy. So here am I in my resource group. I will go to deployment stacks. Remember I said it's called deployment stacks in most places, but deployment groups in other. Deployment stacks. So now I have a stack called space dev. I go into that and it'll show me, it was green, right? That was a green check mark. Cool. So it'll show me all the resources that it created. Look at all those delicious DNS zones. Oh, look how beautiful that is. And all the links, the VNet links it created for me. Scroll. And then it creates my virtual network. It creates my Azure Monitor PLS. It creates my log. All this stuff gets created for me. Now what's neat is that I can delete this whole thing just from here. And it'll delete for the most part. Usually. Now what I want to do is I want to create my application. So my application, find my GitHub is here, and
that's been
so now I say I want to deploy my workload. My workload is my application, which was a SQL Server and a app service. So I'll say I want to deploy workload. So I'll say I want to deploy this into dev. I want to deploy my to-do list workload. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of taking the names of spaces and I'm copy and pasting it across. Now this is not automatic. This is done by humans to build this. So no magic going on here. This is something that we explicitly create the names of the spaces because we know that that's the spaces you're creating. So when whoever runs this script to deploy a workload, then that's what they're going to deploy. I'll run that.
Spin up.
What does that look like? Well, I have another very complex configuration file that I'm dealing with. This is pretty neat. So I'm going to say this is a web app workload. I'm going to give I need to pass the name of the space, the name of the workload. So in this case, it's dev and to-do list. Have a size for the application. So now I'm not saying like D1 or E whatever or X number CPU with 12 GPUs connected to it. I'm going to use t-shirt sizes. And I'm going to say small, medium, large. What do I got? In this case, my options are large, medium, small, extra small. So that's what I've defined. And so what I do in my platform description is I say, all right, this is what they map onto from a VM standpoint, from an app service standpoint. And so now the people that are using this don't have to know what's supported in my region, which one do you recommend I use, what's a small one, what's the right one to use, V1, V2, V3, V4, V5 of which of these SKUs. We say, this is the SKU you're going to use for this purpose. And we have it at the top. I'll say, okay, I want to use a SQL Server database. Make that optional. And I want you to create this database. I can create multiple databases and have it create them at deployment time. What does this look like? This is a little more complicated. So I have to do a little bit of magic juju. So one is that I want to take the names of the subnets and I want to create the subnet IDs, the resource ID for them. So when I want to reference the subnet in any of my other resources, I have to give the full ID / subscriptions, whatever UUID I have, / resource groups, my RG name, the VNet name, VNet's VNet name, subnet name. It hurts. Where am I going to put that? Hey, user, type it in. No, that's not nice. So I know the names of the subnet, the roles that I have. All right, these are the 5 roles I have. I have a function that generates the name of the subnet, and I have a function that generates the resource ID. Because I know the VNet name, I know the subnet name, I know the resource group, I can generate a resource ID. And so what I tell Bicep to do is I say, use a map function. This is a Lambda function. So what I can do is I can take a collection, I can apply it to a Lambda function and it transforms it into an object that has a role property, which is the subnet role. It has a name, which is the name of the network subnet. And it has a resource ID, which is the resource ID that I want to attack. Then I call to object, which says convert that list of things into an object, into a map, into a dictionary. And the key is the role name. And the object is the name and the ID. What does this look like when I want to use it? I get to do something cool like, where are you about, buddy? Here, like this. I'll say subnets.app.id. Real nice, right? I know I want the app subnet. I want the ID of it. Just drop it in. So now I've created some little friendliness for my team that says, hey, when you want to use this, just give me actually the team never sees this because all they're telling me is I have an app and a database in this space. They never see the network name. They never see the network IDs. They don't care because the script knows that I want to connect the database. I need a private link, so I'm going to connect it here. I have an app service. I have to connect to this subnet. I want to connect it here. Let me just do that for you, right? You don't have to tell me. I know. I'm a professional. So then when they actually use it, it just looks like this. Give me a web app called this. Give me actually I didn't put a name. Oh, no, I didn't. I call it workload to-do list. And then it just creates the pieces that I need. So when I go back into my definitely working space,
that's been
fine. The SQL Server takes a little long to do. Let's see how far I got. So I can actually jump to the deployment itself, and you can actually see some of the guts of it here. Of course, it's complete. Yeah, it is. Here we go. So what's neat here, and let me see if I can make this a little bigger. So you see kind of like
that spin
of course.
that spin
dot, dot, dot. So the deployment resource is there. And if I look at the name of it, it's going to generate a new name. If I look at the details, it's got my little nicer name here, to-do list, dev, and it creates. See, because this is a deployment group, it's appending it with some stuff. But here's the name that I gave it. The workload to-do list dev. And then I called it app was the module name. And then number 1 is the actual other module name that I gave it.
That spin up, that spin up, that spin up. That spin up.
Oh, the number, I'll show you where I put that in. That is intentional. I did do that. So what's in here is diagnostic settings, the web, the site, this creates the site slot, I think it is, or the other piece. What is this?
That spin up.
It creates 2 things. Oh yeah.
That spin up, that spin up, that
just depends on how some of the stuff gets created. So then it gives you the app service. Oh, it gives you the app service plan, ends up with the same name. So I create app service plan, I create the app service, I plug it in, all the cool stuff, all the default things are there. I did not have to do too much on this. Anyone who set up an app service by hand, by ARM template, woof, that's a pain in the butt.
That's
all right. And then real quick, what that looks like from this standpoint is I've got me, so like the app, for example, does the site deployment. There's some settings that I have baked in here. From here, what I'll do is I'll just say I want to deploy the app, and I'll call it deployment name -app. And then when I get, so here's how I named the -app came from the name. And then when I get into the app itself, this deployment is another piece, so I call it -1 because it's the first one I'm deploying on there, so I just call it -1. These deployment names should be, they're gonna have a bit of flex in the first name of the deployment, because when I do it from GitHub, I give it a name that's unique to the GitHub run, which is where you're gonna see that kind of unique identifier. And that way I can uniquely identify them as separate ones. But when I put it into a deployment group, deployment stack, then it's going to tie it together the same. As long as I use the same stack name, it's going to reference it correctly. All right. That is all the code pieces. Everything seemed to deploy correctly. Let's get into real quick what it looks like. So I've got some stuff. This is me last night getting things deployed. Error, 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 error. Here's the thing that sucks. 4 minutes. 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes. Every time you do a build and test run cycle, 3 minutes. And that's 1 error message each time. SQL Server, hey, this SKU doesn't work with this capacity. Okay, let me go find it, fixed it. Okay, now this max number doesn't work with that SKU. Okay, let me fix that. Now, this feature you have here doesn't work over here. Okay, then at the end, you can't deploy this resource by policy.
That spin up.
5 minutes each time. So I have a 5-minute break before the rage. I don't know if that makes me angrier or less angry. I'm not sure which it does. Maybe like it tempers it a bit, and then you're like, okay, cool. So deployment groups and stacks, this is super easy because when you're doing iterative work, so the really cool feature of this is that if I, as a developer, remove something from my Bicep, it will delete it if you tell it to from these resources. So the stacks are great. Groups, stacks are great, because this kind of gives you that Terraform view of like deleting things, whereas normal Bicep plain deployments will just add, create stuff. So this gives you a little more control over what that looks like. Production environment, you can put rules like, hey, put locks on it, do not allow it to be deleted. So you have to like explicitly remove the deny, and then you can delete stuff. And there's other rules and stuff you can put in to make it interesting.
Spin up.
And there's some kind of like ongoing examples. I've got some, you can read this one on your own a bit, but main thing I wanted to get across is like, this is a starting point. Like this is a way, this is not the final way to do stuff. We didn't talk about how you deploy code. We didn't talk about how do you do secrets management. We didn't talk about how do you split this up into like not the same resource group. There's a lot to do. So you can explore it on your own with Bicep and find a way to make it work, and find ways to do patterns if you want something simple to start. You can leverage other tools off the shelf to do some of this stuff. So if you use something like Harness, if you use Pulumi, Terraform, they give you a little more complete solutions if you use their services to see how deployments happen. GitHub Actions is a bit slow and cumbersome to work with, but some companies you're in, they're like, this is what you have. You have this and you have this. Go build the world. And so you got to figure out a way to do it. So Bicep is a great way to do that because it's give you a lot of power. It's all baked into Microsoft Stack already. It's all baked into your Microsoft tools already.
Spin up.
Why not? It's a great way to start. I put a link to the community calls for Bicep. These are really good, like to learn about new features that are coming up, but also like they're usually pretty active with the Microsoft people that are working on the features. And then there's also AVM community calls, which are interesting too. So if you want to see what they're doing with some of the patterns and practices, that's there as well. Any questions about anything? Anything you want me to kind of go look at or dig a little deeper into and show some specifics, curiosities?
Spin up.
Yeah.
So I've figured out, which is when I'm buying my SQL databases, it's not idempotent, so I can't, if I run it again, and the database is still there, it breaks. How do I check for the resource being there and skip creating this in Bicep?
So you can reference existing. So in Bicep, is the name of the database the same? But it tries to create it again when you're going back in. So if the resource is fully
breaks the second time, so I want to create it the first time, and it always works.
Okay.
Run it the second time.
That's odd.
Yeah.
What I would expect, so you can reference the databases separately, like make them into a separate deployment step. So it's like I create the server, I create my Elastic pools, I let all of that spin up and be nice and warm, and then I create my database and bring it into the Elastic pools and manage it how I want to manage it. I would separate the steps, and then that way you get a bit more control over how you're deploying them. But you can reference like existing resource, like Bicep will, if you have a resource of the same name, it will not create a duplicate. Like it should match it up.
It does.
As long as something's not different, or the name doesn't have some randomization in it.
Yeah, it breaks because you can't set the account name on an existing database. Basic from Bicep.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So Bicep there's a pattern in Bicep that you do. So can I show it? It's a little complicated. So there is a pattern in Bicep where what you're doing is you create a module. And what you want to do is you want this module to do one of two things: either create the resource for you, or reference the existing one, and then output the ID back to you. So you spin it up into a separate module, and then so your logic that says is an existing one, does it exist? And I think you have to do it in two modules actually, because there's some goofiness with the way that some dependencies work. And so you have to have a way to pass it an existing identifier and say, did that resource actually populate? Right. And then do a check to say if it exists or not. And then if it existed, then you do the other thing. If it doesn't exist, then you do the other thing. Okay, what I have seen more reliably is people have to do it from outside and do like some other API check that says, did this thing get created? And then pass a list of the databases it finds, like, hey, here's the databases I know exist. Here's the ones that are there. And then you do some logic inside Bicep to like avoid trying to do the resource check. Because what's supposed to happen is that when the names match, it passes it in. Like you said, the account thing is the goofy.
Yeah, it's a SQL database thing. It tries to just,
What you can also try to do is use either a tag or some other marker that says I've already done this activity. And that way you check for that tag, because the resource exists. You check for that tag and be like, oh, that tag exists. Or if it's outside of it somewhere, you've got something special stashed in your server tags. But you can't go too big. There's you can get really goofy with it.
Yeah. So something less effort.
Yeah. And this is the kind of the challenge with. Because at the end of the day, what's happening is that Azure Resource Manager is making a bunch of API calls on your behalf as best that it can, passing all of the things dutifully to the target. And so what you end up having to do is you have two versions. So this happens with storage accounts. Storage accounts have a flag called hierarchical file system setting. If the flag is unset, then you can set it once. And you can set it to true or you can set it to false. Now, if it was unset and you're trying to set it to true again, and someone already set it to true, you might have a problem because it says you can't set it again, even though you're setting it at the same value. And if you set it to false, it definitely won't work because then you can't set it. But if you leave it unset, now it gets even angrier because it's like you're not setting it. It's trying to do something different. So you kind of have to do this little, no. He's like, oh yeah, I remember that. You kind of have to do some extra logic that tries to find that resource. And then so have a module that's basically like, okay, if I find the resource, I'm going to give you the ID. If I don't find the resource, I'm not going to return the ID. So the cool thing about Bicep is you can do a lot of like weird side logic in modules and then have that execute first and have your main deployment depend on it. And then you'll just make that account block optional and say, if I got an ID from here, don't populate this account block, just skip it.
Yeah.
If you can take that account block and move it out into a separate deployment, into a separate like resource line altogether, it's even better because then you can make that into a separate conditional thing or put it into another module. But sometimes I have a feeling that you have to do that at deployment time, otherwise your security policies will kick in and security policies will say like, you didn't set an account, how could you? You monster. I don't think that's how policies talk. They should. They really should.
Right. Question from Daniel. Are there any validation or dry run modules that would help with the deployment error debugging that we saw for the minute?
Yes. So phase one is that in VS Code, we'll kind of give you a hint at something is working, not working. We would try to open the files and be like, this is the files I'm working on. Like, make sure nothing turns red. This one turned kind of yellow because I was yellow is red. It says, hey, this doesn't exist. This is error, or is this a, let's see, it doesn't exist, although it might still be valid. So it'll kind of flag stuff for you at compile time. I have in my workflows a validate step that I do here. So validate will basically try to do a pre-deployment check and will actually trigger any policy stuff that it can. If it can trigger a policy check, it'll trigger it there too. Sometimes, but it gives you a kind of good validation like, hey, is this a well-formed and mostly correct, as far as you know, deployment file? Will give you kind of that introductory thing. The best thing to do, deploy it. There is a what if, but deployment stack and what if do not exist together yet. I don't think it's in preview yet either, but these don't exist together yet. But deployment stack, the main feature of it is that you can deploy a whole thing off to the side and then obliterate it when you're done. So it's a great way to just test. Just create it with unique names of everything. As long as you're not creating anything too special that's like tenant unique, then you can just create a resource group and then deploy it on the side, see if it works. If it works, great, it worked. Examine it, make sure all the things are what you expect, because you're going to do that anyway, right? Validation, not fully reliable. What if, not fully reliable. You know what is? Deploying all your stuff. That's actually going to tell you what's going to happen. You have to deploy your stuff for it to tell you what's going to happen when you deploy your stuff.
Spin off.
And this is not just Azure, right? AWS does this, GCP does this, or they all do this because it's complicated. It's a bunch of software written by a bunch of different people. They're trying to do a bunch of stuff to make it nice for you, but is it always going to work right? Not always. Is it complicated? Yes, it is. This is why they pay us the money. So short answer for the line is that yes, there are validation steps, but what I found in personal practice is that having a way to do a fast deploy loop in a way that you can create things and destroy them is much more valuable because you're going to get there anyway.
Spin off.
Other questions?
Spin off. Spin off.
Which one? This one? Okay. So this is GitHub Action substitution. So what I'm doing is, when you saw me do the deployment, this is some GitHub Actions fun. So when you saw me do the deployment, let's come on, click. So when I click deploy, there's some parameters here I can specify. So it's actually defined, the inputs is defining these, and then it's substituting them in. So I make these choices where I could put a list of the choices in here.
And
then that makes it easy for me. So now it's like, I don't have to type it in, right? It's like, well, what should I put in here? Put dev, capital D, lowercase e, capital V? No. Like dev with 6 V's? No. Just DEV. Dev. What's wrong with you?
that, spin up,
Yes.
that, spin up.
So up here, there's parameters, operation, space, and workload. And then would GitHub recognize, GitHub Actions will take this as a substitution, the dollar with the two curlies, and then we'll process the expression inside. There is an expression that doesn't need curlies, which is if, because it knows that there's always going to be an expression. So you don't have to surround it with the curly stuff.
That, spin up. That, spin up. That, spin up. That, spin up.
So what you'd need is you'd need a way to generate the names of things. So if you went back to my name functions that I had and pull those out or make a little module that generates the names of stuff, then kind of make that as your parent module. And then that way, when you have your deployment, if it's part of the Bicep deployment, then you can pull those references and use it. But if it's through something else, you can, when you do a Bicep deploy, you can have it deploy nothing except for a deployment and then generate outputs and then capture those outputs in your GitHub Actions. So this Bicep deploy action will take the outputs from your deployment and create them as outputs in the step. And so then you can bring those outputs back into GitHub Actions and use
That, spin up.
it.
That, spin up. That, spin up. That, spin up.
It depends. So short answer is it depends, because that's going to depend on how you want to deploy stuff. There's a lot of other stuff to do.
That, spin up. That, spin up. That, spin up. That, spin up.
It's
That,
another
spin up.
talk. It's another talk altogether. Madam. Yeah.
All right. Who learned something? Yeah, that was great. Thank you, Garo. That was fantastic. That's
That, spin up.
we're out of time still, unfortunately, so we're gonna close it up. We're gonna close it up. Yeah. Thank you all for coming out. Thanks.
That, spin up. That.